Hello, my name is Dr. Sidney Freeman, and I'm the host of Saturday Soul that is presented by the Liberation Movement. I am so excited to be with you today to talk about a process and program that is really important to the liberation of Black people, which is Black liberation. But we have one of our board members, Brittany Hughes, who we'll bring up in a few seconds, that we'll have a conversation about reparations in the Black community. I want to share with the audience that on Thursday, my father passed away, and what I want to dedicate this program to him. I know he would want me to keep moving forward, and he knew how passionate we both are about the notion of liberation and also reparations, that Black people in the United States are owed a deep debt to this country, from this country. So with that, let's bring on a board member of the Liberation Movement and one with their own stellar background, attorney Brittany Hughes.
Hi.
Brittany, how are you?
I'm good, Dr. Freeman. How are you?
I'm good. So I'm looking forward to this. Let this just be a conversation. I know we've both had some time to look at the book on reparations by Dr. Darity and Kirsten Mullen. And thank you for those condolences, those who have posted that in the chat. So let's just begin by asking you, what is reparations in your perspective?
I mean, that's obviously the natural beginning to this conversation. Like, what is reparations? And ever since you invited me to this show, I've kind of really been thinking through that. I think oftentimes when we discuss reparations, we're thinking primarily of financial reparations, which is appropriate given the economic contributions Black people have made to this country and really to countries across the globe, even though they might not have been the predominant race there. And so economic provisions are certainly a part of my definition of reparations. But I think that going beyond that, for me, something that I think should also be considered in conversations of what reparations are is also access to knowledge and history, if that makes any sense. And so what I mean by that is that, to me, reparations look like more than just providing Black people with economic provisions to, maintain and advance financially in this country, but it also looks like providing provisions to growth and development and to historical data that we've previously lost. So it also looks like an effort to reconnect Black people with their family and familial ancestral roots, through efforts to show them or find ways in which find their trails and the lines in which their families might have come to this country. And it also looks like providing them access to resources such as education, healthcare, that will allow them to maintain or sustain I don't want to say worthy, but a less complicated life, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I was at Oakwood, I remember being in the dorm in Peterson Hall, arguing back and forth with poli-sci majors about are we going to get reparations, right? We had arguments about if we were going to have a Black president, all those kinds of things, right? And it's so crazy that it was just I was there. This was maybe in 2003, 2004, having these arguments, robust arguments. And now we've had a black president, and we now have a Black vice president of the United States, and that just seemed like that could never happen, right?
Right.
And so one of the things that I've found interesting is having different discussions with people about this program in particular, about, you know, could this really ever work? Could we ever really be restored in that way? And so while no one really pushes back and says we're not owed this, they don't say that, you know, other groups they acknowledge that other groups have had access to restitution, whether it's the Japanese or other groups or Native Americans. But it's something about Black people. They're saying, no, this can't happen. What are your thoughts related to that?
So, you know me, like I wasn't a poli-sci major. I was an international studies major, but having, you know, gone through law school and been very well acquainted with like our legal systems, our policy in this country, my answer is going to sound maybe a little bit different than what you might have heard. So I don't think it's a matter of whether or not it can happen. I think, though, that the scope of how it happens and the way in which it happens is something that we should expand our ideas on. So I think oftentimes when people discuss reparations, particularly in the US, we look at it in the context of this is something that the United States government needs to provide to Black people here, to Black Americans and all these things. But I would challenge that because slavery was not just a United States thing. It was a very real global trade and industry. And so there were countries aside from the United States that were complicit in slavery, that were actively involved and really pretty much touching pretty much most, if not every continent. So I think that's the first, I don't want to say error, but that to me is the first aspect of things that I would consider as far as like, let's look at the global aspect of what slavery was and how getting reparations, you know, in that space would really look. I think the other thing that I would consider is the history of the United States in a way. And what I mean by that is that the US is very different than a lot of other countries in that, whether people like to admit it or not, given our last president, this is a country that was very much so built on immigration. And immigration has always been a vital component to the survival and the economic prosperity of the US. Understanding that Black immigrants also have a special and unique experience coming to the US. And many who have come to the US, while they might not have been here during slavery, or they might not have come during even the civil rights movement. I think one of the biggest peaks in immigration to the US from predominantly Black countries was really during the 80s and 90s, specifically from the Caribbean. While they might not have been here during those times, many of them have unfortunately encountered and had to live with the very real realities of racism and its impact in this country on Black progression, Black economic status, and all of these other things. So then the question that is almost always posed when we're discussing reparations and how do we do it is, okay, if we're looking at reparations solely in the US, are we providing reparations to all members of the Black diaspora who reside in the US, or are we only providing reparations to individuals who are descendant of the slaves who docked in the US? And that can become, which I don't like to use that because I know it can be very controversial.
I know. I got
yeah, but that is a question that always arises. And in my personal perspective, I think that all members of the Black diaspora are entitled to reparations in some form. And that's why I go back to my first point, which is let's look at the global aspect of this thing. So in looking at that, do we think that the US Congress is the best vehicle for allowing that to come to pass? Or do we now start looking at international organizations such as the United Nations and things of that nature, and global treaties in that sense, to decide whether or not something more comprehensive or something that involves more governments as opposed to just the US government would be a better vehicle for providing people throughout the diaspora the reparations that we are entitled to?
We're going to have a real, so I'm on that other end, right? So I'm on that other end. So this is going to be a really good conversation. So Um, one of the I'm still trying to process how a Pan-Africanist or a diasporic approach would work and is enforceable, particularly by the United Nations, when a lot of times the United Nations needs they're not as strong as we would like them to be, and even these other organizations. But some people make a unique claim. We have a particular unique claim here in the United States. Versus, and there's just this whole discussion of like Jamaica right now. I'm sure you've heard about this. Jamaica is petitioning to create its own reparations program, and it's something interesting about the United States that when I'll call them ADOS, but we can call them Black Americans or people who are descendants of the enslaved Africans here. There's no problem there. There isn't a problem when we say Jamaica or Trinidad and Tobago or other places say we have a claim to reparations, right, in a particular way. But when Black Americans here in the United States say that, it's posed as divisive. And so I remember with talking with one of our board members here at the Liberation Movement, when I used the language ADOS, he was like, will that alienate some people? And I was saying, my thing is that I actually, I like the delineation of saying there are people that have a unique claim to the United States.
Right.
However, that does not preclude us being having diasporic conversations, right? And supporting one another. So I think each country probably should study itself and figure out an approach that works for them, and then partner and support each other. So it may be a different way of doing it versus start out trying to be broad. But that's just my perspective. You can push back on me. I
think that there's a lot of merit to that perspective. And I think, like, generally speaking, when we talk about Black people, there's just so much diversity culturally within the diaspora. Much of that is directly attributable to slavery, right? Like, who enslaved who, where they landed, the geography and all those different things impacted what they ate, what they listened to, how they spoke, and who they interacted with. And so much of that diversity in our diaspora is, directly attributable to slavery, which means that the solutions or the reparations that come as a result of the slavery that we've each experienced might need to look different for people in different spaces. I don't think that is necessarily a bad thing at all. But that is another reason why I say that it's something to me that, like, should probably, in my personal opinion, be worked out on a more global scale than solely just in the US. Now to the comment that you made as far as, like, using language like ADOS when discussing reparations and, like, the division that can cause here in the US specifically, I would agree that it's not a term that I've gotten much excitement about. I don't think that people really like to hear it. And I think that this is a very complex thing to state, but one of the differences, or one of the unique factors, and I really wouldn't even say it's solely unique to African Americans, because I think you can find people in similar situations probably in the UK. But one of the unique things about African Americans is that, or who are descendants of slaves who came to the US, is that we are very much a complex and thriving, living, impactful, influential culture, but we lack our own country. And so in many ways, a lot of for other members of the diaspora, a lot of the pride and things that they might feel, or a lot of the a lot of the pride or a lot of the joy that they might take in their identity can be tied to them having been a part of a culture that was cultivated, but not only cultivated, but was legitimized because it became its own country. Haiti, Jamaica, so many other, even like Liberia, so many other predominantly Black countries, while they were impacted by slavery, and that is a part of their history, there has been a legitimization of them because they have come to the world stage in their own country with their own land. So if we're looking at that context in the terms of reparations, and let's say that tomorrow, I don't know, Joe Biden or somebody is like, look, we want to give people reparations. So like, we're going to stick to what we said. We're going to give, or rather United Nations, not Joe Biden. Let's say the United Nations, like, look, we're going to give people of the Black diaspora 40 acres and a mule, right? Would that mean the same thing to an African American or a Black American in the U.S. as it would to maybe to a Jamaican national or a Haitian national who might already own land in a country where land is predominantly owned by people who look like them? It might not mean the same thing, right? Whereas when we look at land ownership here, Black people are very easily in the minority, and the number of Black people who own land here is like small in comparison to our counterparts. So go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that one of the complicated things is that we also have to deal with the indigenous people here, right? So when we start talking about liberation, we start talking about sovereignty of land.
Whose land is it to give?
Yeah, who is, so they would be saying that we all occupy, anybody that's not indigenous should not be occupying this land. Now, there can be, partnerships or whatever we create, but I think it's pretty messy given the way that the country has kind of developed itself. But I'm cutting you off. I'm sorry.
No. But that's a very solid point. And I think when we start looking at reparations solely from the economic aspect, we run into issues like that, because then it's like, who does this belong to? Who has a rightful claim to this? And who even had the right to give it away? And so when we look at it from an economic standpoint, you start to run into issues like that. As I was kind of thinking through this topic, specifically the idea of like maybe a reparations program being one that would be administered by an international organization, the cases that kept coming to mind for me were cases dealing with the Rwandan genocide. I know that sounds like really left field, right? But for those of you who might be familiar, or I hope everyone has heard about it in some capacity, but for those of you who might not be familiar with the Rwandan genocide, it took place in the 90s. A mass amount of Tutsis were killed, and in restoring the country and trying to move forward from the tragedy of the genocide, the United Nations was involved. They set up human rights courts or tribunals that were run through the United Nations, and they also set up these things called gacaca courts, which are really like community courts where peers would kind of be the judges and jurors of each other. So people who were admired in the community and things like that. And so we see that that has happened in the 90s, that Rwanda has gone through this whole process of trying to restore itself from this tragedy that occurred between between groups that were native there and groups that belonged there. And we look at Rwanda today, and not to say that it's a perfect country, but as far as violence is concerned, it's probably one of the safest countries in East Africa. It has a fully functioning economy. Laws have been changed in an effort to prioritize healing and prioritize restoration amongst that group of people. One of them being is that prior to the genocide, people were identified, whether on ID or in schools, as Hutu or Tutsi, and now I don't know that it's illegal, but it's very much so frowned upon to to inquire or to require that someone identifies solely as Hutu or Tutsi, rather it's like, I'm Rwandan, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And so to me, when I look at that case and I look at international intervention, even though it was too late, or the United Nations intervention and the aftermath, it becomes very clear to me that there needs to be a conduit for healing and a conduit for dialogue as far before restoration can actually occur, whether economically or physically or in any other matter. And so to me, what's missing a lot of times in these conversations surrounding reparations, whether it be for African Americans or Black people throughout the diaspora, is that conduit for healing and that conduit for dialogue prior to coming to a conclusion on what physical means need to be provided in order to, I don't even like to say make whole, because in reality, there's nothing that will be given to make this situation whole, but that may be somewhat acceptable to people in that group. Does that make any sense?
It makes a lot of sense. There's a couple of things that are running through our mind, so I'm going to throw it out there, and then you respond or catch it. But one of the things that I'm thinking about, and we possibly can go back to it, because we're people of faith.
Right.
What is the role of the church? What is the role of those who are believers in advancing the cause of reparations? That's one thing. The other thing that I wanted to bring to your attention is there was something called the New Africa movement. I believe it was in the late 60s in Detroit. And the New Africa movement was this movement that essentially said that we should own land in the most populous states in Black states. So essentially that was in the South. So I'm looking at it now. So it's Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina. That would be a place that we would own our own. We would have our own sovereign land. Those states would be ours. Now, of course, as I said, that would be problematic as it relates to kind of Native American indigenous piece. But even that thought process about if we would talk about reparations, what, originally we talked about, yes, a financial piece, but there's also the land piece. The land piece that's important, and I just came back from the Equal Justice Institute in Montgomery, and just to think about kind of the lynching, people have been lynched over their land. They've been, we think about Tulsa, all those kinds of things. So I know I threw a couple of things out there, but just wanted to get your thoughts about, if we're talking about reparations, should we be talking about it in the context of land? And if we're talking about land, should we be trying to make ourselves some type of sovereign people with our own kind of almost kind of a make Atlanta? We take Atlanta as a mecca and just build it out to the rest of the South.
Yeah, no, those are really good questions. So I had to take notes. I had to write. So I'll start with the question on the church. What is the role of the church in advancing reparations? And to me, this is kind of an age-old question, because we've always asked, what is the role of the church in advancing racial equity generally, right? I think obviously the answer to this question will vary based on who you ask. So you asked me, so I'll tell you what I think. I think I think the role of the church should be an active one. The reality of what we are experiencing, however, though, is that the church, and I will really only speak about what I've seen in Christian denominations. I won't speak to other denominations because I'm not as familiar. But the church has in many ways missed opportunities to be actively involved in advancing racial equity or advancing reparations or other mechanisms of promoting racial equity, because in many ways it would likely be detrimental to the structure of the church. I'm just saying there are there are a lot of components of institutional religion that benefit from white supremacy, from patriarchy,
Is
and
that
all these.
did the black church benefit from white supremacy, or just the white part of the church?
I don't see any situations where the black church benefits from white supremacy, but there are instances, which I think even Carter G. Woodson spoke about in his book, The Miseducation of the Negro, where the black church does benefit from classism, which is, a whole different conversation, right?
Yeah.
There's a certain status that might be attained in society or community that makes a particular being member of a particular church more of an elite thing, and there is separation between classes of rich and poor in the Black community in our churches, which has been, to be quite honest with you, detrimental to the communal growth of the Black community, truthfully. So sorry, were you about to say something?
No, I was going. No, I was just going to say, those that are watching, I wanted to give them an opportunity. If you have questions, please put them in the chat. We'll take your questions. We're having a good time with our conversation, but we want to bring you in. But finish, Brittany.
Yeah, so like I said, I think that there have been benefits of classism within the Black church, or that certain members of Black churches have benefited from classism. I don't know that they have, as an institution, have really benefited from white privilege or from white supremacy, but I can say that there might have been individuals who themselves might have found a way to benefit from white supremacy in some case, whether that be by like tokenism, whatever. So the role of the church, like I said, should be an active one in advancing racial equity. And really, I do believe that if our churches, particularly Christian churches, lived by what Bell Hooks describes as a love ethic, then there would be a very strong case for the church to then want to advance things such as reparations or other mechanisms that promote racial equity. But too often, and this is very unfortunate, our churches do not really rely on the power and the strength of love, even though we preach it. And we rely more so on economic provisions. And I'm just being honest. I could go down a whole hippie road about this, and how I feel that like the main message of our churches that is preached, which is love, is not always exercised in our politics and in our actions. But that's just me. So I think the church should play an active role in that. Whether or not I believe that they are doing it now, in truth, I do not. But I don't think that it's past redemption. And leaders, young leaders, such as yourself, as me, who are involved in our churches, or who seek to be involved in churches and seek to grow spiritually in that space, should take seriously their role in changing those institutions so that they are driven by love ethic, and thus more involved in creating a space of equity amongst all of us. And I don't just mean that for Black people, although I know that's what we're discussing today. I mean that for everyone, no matter their background. That is something that we should all be invested in. We should all be invested in remedying the inequities that have oppressed other people, whether they look like us or not. That is what it is to live a love ethic.
What you're saying is powerful stuff. I've been really thinking about the way in which, for instance, this particular platform, how we can, although it is one that we would in some ways see as a ministry, but that it be one that would be active, right? It would be active and model this love ethic that we're talking about. Right. And in particular, focusing in on the needs of Black people within the diaspora. But let's go to that second part where you were going to address this whole land piece and that kind of stuff.
So I had never heard of the movement you described where there was, I guess, kind of a discussion about us occupying land in certain states, predominantly Black states, like or cities like Atlanta or, Mississippi and things like that. I'd never heard of that, but I think that's a very interesting concept. I guess the question, in you posing the question, a question to me came to mind. And really that question is, what is the goal or the purpose that you are trying to achieve by owning land? And I think for many of us, land symbolizes and often can be a mechanism for maintaining and advancing generational wealth. It is a mechanism for earning a living. You can, if you own your land, you can build on your land. You can thus make money off of your land. It essentially represents a form of economic freedom. So that to me, it ties in multiple things, and I hope y'all stay with me on this. That to me begs the question, given the current state of our Earth, CC climate crisis,
right,
is owning land in particular places or owning land generally as economically beneficial as it once was in the past? And if it's not, is there another mechanism where we can reach the same goal without necessarily having the 40 acres?
Okay.
So I think that, to me, that question, it opens the door for, I think, some creative thinking, right? Because let's say they're like, all right, everybody, you know what? You're right. We were wrong. Slavery sucked. This is what we're going to do. Line up. Everybody's getting beachfront property in Florida. What is beachfront property? I mean, in Miami, what is beachfront property in Florida gonna look like or be for us come 2045, right? What is that gonna look like?
Be looking good.
It might not be looking good. So, like, all land is not made equal, and we can get land, but like, will it then, give us what we're looking for, especially if we don't have arable land, meaning land that we can grow on? Is it going to then give us the results that we're seeking? Are there other mechanisms that we could utilize? What if it's something different? What if it's stock? What if it's Bitcoin? What if it is opportunity to create or build business without economic hindrance? Meaning, I don't have to pay to establish an LLC. I don't have to pay for this. What if it's just access to other things? And so I think land can be beneficial, and for many people, that option might be best. But I will say, for me, if you give me a piece of land, God forbid, I don't even know if I can maintain it. But like, that's just me. So I think that that the solutions that we discussed and that were traditionally deemed as appropriate in years past need to be reevaluated for the times that we're in and reconsidered, and creative options should be brought in to discuss meeting that need. If the need or the desire or the purpose is building generational wealth, we might be able to acknowledge that owning land is not the only way to do that. It might be the most traditional and, the one that people might be much more comfortable with, but it might not be the only way.
No, I hadn't thought of you're pushing my thinking with the Bitcoin piece. So one of the things that was spoken about in the book on reparations was this idea that it could be upwards of $12 trillion to, if we were to look at let me get my notes right. If you take into account Jim Crow, slavery, physical, emotional horrors of slavery, the inherent coercive nature of the system of slavery, the denial of the opportunity to acquire property or some degree of autonomy, denial of control over one's family, right? If you take on all these kind of different elements, right? And the book was advocating that the book was advocating that that it couldn't be that it can't just be slavery that we're looking at. It has to be kind of a comprehensive piece, and that it needed to come from Congress, not the legal system, because they said, look at Brown v. Board, look at all of these different legal precedents, even if it comes down from the Supreme Court that they should stop segregating schools or whatever it was, redlining, people still do it. So they lack the legal enforcement where Congress has the resources to implement that. So what are your they really don't talk about the executive branch in the book and as an instrument to make this happen. What are your thoughts regarding looking at Congress, given your background and perspective?
So I think, generally speaking, on any subject or any solution that you're trying to implement that you want to be sustainable, particularly in the U.S., it should come through Congress, because legislating through the courts and legislating through the executive branch, even though neither the courts or the executive branch is supposed to legislate, is a very difficult, and it's not as sustainable. So I'm gonna, and maybe this is the wrong assumption, but for those who are familiar with the U.S. government system, we have three branches. We have the executive branch, we have the judicial branch, we have Congress, all equal in their power, but they do different things. Of course, in modern times, as we have government agencies, and as we have seen through other cases, we have instances where courts will create precedent, or they will make law based on their interpretation of rules, even though Congress might not have passed that specific wording, right? And with executive agencies, Congress has legislated, allowing some of them power to make what are called rules, which essentially have the weight of law, right? And we've seen that probably most recently, or in most recent history, we've seen that on the forefront when it came to DACA, right? Through the executive branch, President Obama said, deferred action for, early childhood arrivals and things like that. I can do that through my executive powers. Congress has given me that power. And we saw the swing of what happens when you switch administrations, when Trump was like, no new applicants. And now we're back to like DACA being opened and other things. And so we see the turmoil that comes with legislating through the executive branch, or through the judicial branch, is that the judges change, and administrations change, so policy goals change. But what Congress passes into law is much more difficult to change, and meets a higher standard in order to be changed. Like, it has to be essentially unconstitutional. So with that being said, on anything, I think that getting the law passed in Congress is the most sustainable way to do it, to do anything. And that's any law that you want to implement. If you want to implement a law where puppies get hugs every 5 days, doing it through Congress versus doing it through any other branch is the most sustainable way.
And with that, we'll close out our program. Make sure to visit us at the-liberation-movement.com to learn more about the work that we're doing through the Liberation Movement. Have a wonderful afternoon.